AI Realized, the podcast about everything that is new now and next for enterprise executives deploying AI. Hosted by myself, Christina Elwood, and my collaborator, David Yakobovich.
And our guests will share what's driving AI adoption, use cases, and business models for the data and AI economy.
Welcome to the next episode of AI Realized, the podcast for enterprise executives leading AI deployments. From addressing security, data, and operations challenges to managing organizational and management changes, AI deployments present the opportunity to redesign our organizations from the inside out. In this episode, we'll talk about what's new and now. I'm your host, Christina Elwood, and we're talking today with Mark Heynen, Chief Product Officer and co-founder of Knapsack. Mark, welcome to AI Realized.
Happy to be here.
You're a serial entrepreneur. What inspired you to start Knapsack?
So Knapsack was really created out of a lived experience that me and my co-founder both had. We had been working in startups. Both of us met each other at PayJoy, which I co-founded in 2015. He was one of the first 4 engineers at PayJoy. And he was at Lambda Labs and interacting with a lot of data with LLMs and also seeing how companies were adopting AI. I was actually at within the fintech environment, seeing how regulated finance companies were reacting to ChatGPT being available to this very powerful LLM technology and seeing them really struggle because the best way to use this technology for them was to upload a lot of data into LLM clouds, whether it was ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or other things. But ultimately, they were not allowed to do that. Their regulatory status does not allow them to do that. They were very concerned about private information, sensitive information leaking. It was unclear and still remains unclear to most people what might happen to that data once it's uploaded. Ultimately, there's always the risk of it being used for training, even when people say they won't use it for training. There is the risk of data leakage. We've recently had a couple of high-profile leaks, AT&T and other leaks, where very sensitive information was leaked out. And different CISOs I've talked to have indicated that ultimately data security is now becoming a really challenging area because of AI, because now people are uploading a lot of data up into AI systems. So we had this intuition that this was a significant problem that was not being addressed by any of the people starting companies. A lot of people starting companies were just sidestepping this problem and starting on top of ChatGPT or on top of other APIs. And then we saw the Microsoft Work Trends survey, which said that 78% of people were actually using consumer tools at work. And that really was a wake-up call for us because that's a big number. I mean, this is actually a pool of 31,000 respondents, 31 countries. The number of people using AI at work is very significant. And so the majority of those people are actually not using a tool fit for purpose. And in many cases, in the case of, finance or, as we learned, healthcare, they're actually putting their jobs at risk. They're often not allowed to be uploading data to the tool in their AI policies. But the temptation to use them is so great considering how powerful the technology is. So we realized this is a very significant issue, and no one's found an elegant solution to it. I mean, there's an expensive solution, which is you do a fully on-prem private cloud deployment. Microsoft offers that with OpenAI Azure Service Agreements. Those are $1 million per year on average. So yes, there is an expensive solution, but there's not a widespread accessible solution. And I love those access problems. I mean, those access problems are my bread and butter. That's what I did at PayJoy, where we provided access to smartphones and smartphone finance. And, I loved even back at Google when I worked on Android, which is really fundamentally access to smartphone technology. So Cooper and I thought about it. We realized, well, actually, the fundamental problem is in the architecture. We should not be bringing the data to the AI. We should be bringing the AI to the data. There's no reason in the modern day and age people should round trip and have to upload their data somewhere for it to be processed to get insights on the data back. There's actually plenty of compute available on the edge, as we call it, on your desktop and smartphone. There's also more efficiency being driven by these new smaller language models, so it's possible to run it. And looking forward, as we talked to Qualcomm and looked at projections, more and more GPU capability will be available on smartphones and laptops going forward. So we realized really the best solution to this is bringing AI to the data and allowing people to begin with download an app to their computer, and have that run across their data. That means you can still use cloud data. You just download the cloud data and embed it on your computer. And then eventually people can upgrade to a server-side solution for the enterprise and allow people to access and embed their corporate data, their enterprise data, but again, behind the firewall without having to trust anyone, including us. So in our architecture, we do not have access to the data. We're just providing tools that allow you to have access. So, I spent a little bit of time in crypto. One really interesting part of that is this concept of decentralization. There's no reason why the software should have access to the value. You can write software that can process the value without having access to it. And that's really what we're doing here. Similar to the way WhatsApp works, where they don't have access to the messages, they provide the software to allow you to transmit the messages. So it's a similar concept. And something we've heard was really interesting for the people we interviewed. In all my companies I interview, hundreds of people before we write a single line of code. And we tried to follow the same philosophy here. Did a lot of interviews and realized this is something that people really wanted. And so we are launching an application to allow people to do that.
Wow, there's so much to pick up on in what you just said, Mark. I'm not sure where I want to start, but let's go back to a more basic question. There's a landscape of AI technologies changing very rapidly. You're building on the edge. There are solutions in the cloud. There are large language models, small language models, agents, and compound systems. Can you give us a very simple description of how all those pieces fit today, and then where you are focused on with your technology?
Yeah, I would look at this in a chronological sequence. So we started with large language models, and through recent developments, we've been able to make those large language models accessible to people through cloud services. Now we've seen small language models be available through advances in quantization and advances in pruning and other advances. We've been able to actually get similar functionality to the large language models in small language models. And that's very exciting. A lot of those advances are what's behind Apple Intelligence announcements we've heard recently. Now, agents, I think, are a next iteration. I would say agents are maybe 2 or 3 years out in terms of being very useful for mass market. With agents, you're really trusting an AI to run autonomously, to do things for you without a human in the loop. And I think that raises a lot of questions in terms of accountability and also in terms of, the confidence level that they're going to do a great job. And so one thing we realized is that there's probably a step before we get to agents, which is what we call automations, which is taking this experience we have that we can have a computer actually think about data, read data, produce interesting insights on the data, and even take some actions. But we can do that with a human in the loop to begin with. We can actually, share insights automatically, for example, on your next upcoming meeting. And you can then act on those insights yourself with a human in the loop. You can imagine a physician doing a pre-authorization for a procedure. They automatically have that run and be produced, but ultimately they're the ones reviewing it and then sending it off. It makes them a lot more productive. We can hopefully shave a day off of the work week, but ultimately the humans in the loop. I think agents will come after that. And we're really excited about that future where we then go the next step and have people actually do what we call write automations, where the automations are doing things on their own as well.
Well, physicians are very familiar with that these days too, because they do a lot of their note taking using AI, and then they have to check that note taking.
That's
so
right.
That model seems well suited to the way they're operating even today. So is Knapsack using a open source small language model, or what kind of a model is does the user get to choose?
So right now we're fine-tuning open source models. We find that's the most cost-effective way to get to market. And we want to be the prime beneficiary of a lot of the innovation happening in the open source community. We're seeing so many new things come out every day. And that's where we're starting. I think in the near future, we expect this proliferation of small language models. And we expect us to be able to choose the best small language model for different prompts or different automations. And we really expect to be the switch or the best suited software platform to figure out which small language model to use for which task with which data.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So besides the problems that you've already addressed related to data security and management, you're hinting at compliance issues. Are there other compliance issues that companies need to deal with related to AI that you help with?
There are quite a few. And so we're releasing a white paper shortly that's going to be talking through these compliance issues and what we are helping address. I think if I think about it at the highest possible level, really we have this situation where data is the new oil and we have data everywhere. And we're now going through a stage in humanity, really, where we're trying to wrap our hands around all the data is out there and what kind of rights people should have in relation to their data. And for businesses, this really comes down to the fact that if someone doesn't trust the business with their data, they're going to stop doing business with that data. We've seen, specific reports come out about this. And then Verizon did a data breach report that shows that 36% of breaches actually stem from user errors with using software tools. So it's not always intentional. Sometimes you can upload data somewhere and some sysadmin or someone at the company actually doesn't do something right, or even the person doesn't know what they're doing with their tools. And so really what we are doing is solving this fundamental compliance issue about how do I make sure that as a company, the data on my employees' computers is not being uploaded by mistake to someplace that is not compliant. And that ensures that A, they're compliant with their obligations to other partners where they have confidentiality obligations. It also makes sure they're compliant with the things they've signed up for in terms of certification, whether it's the CCPA or GDPR or HIPAA or SOC 2. There are all sorts of other policies a lot of these companies have signed up for. And then in case of finance, they go one step further where the SEC and the FTC regulates them. So they may have a books and records requirement where they need everything they do logged. And that also requires that everything is done in a certain way. And so ultimately what we are doing is making sure people are compliant by having everything run locally on your device so you have full control of the data and where it goes. And because it actually adopts whatever security policies you already have on the device, you are immediately compliant with all those things. And then on top of that, we are compliant. So we are undergoing and just receiving HIPAA certification. So the application is HIPAA compliant. And we're going through the process of getting other certifications as well. And so you don't have to worry about it. Now, I think with other startups, they often have clouds where they claim some level of compliance. But in the end, do you really want to take the gamble? Something might happen if that data leaks, and that could actually be disastrous for your business.
What other risks do enterprises face when adopting AI?
I think one of the biggest risks that companies are grappling with right now is a risk of sucking the entire company into a high-cost deployment that does not have ROI. And I think we've seen this more recently with some of these large deployments that are being pitched, whether it's by Accenture or Microsoft or even other newer companies like Hebbia. These are extremely expensive deployments. And ultimately, there's a learning process that organizations have to go through. So the ROI is unclear to begin with, to be honest. And then we've seen actually recently there was this great report. Morgan Stanley had a report with an interview with a pharmaceutical executive. I think it was the CTO of Bristol Myers Squibb, who was claiming that the Microsoft deployment that they had paid for had extremely limited ROI and produced PowerPoints that were the equivalent of what a middle schooler might put together. And so no one wants to have that be their legacy in a company. And then on top of that, if you're talking about uploading a whole bunch of data up into a new cloud, you often have to, A, gather that data from multiple clouds, and then you have to have a lawyer get involved to figure out what they can and cannot share. Now, that is extremely high risk that you're going to be sucking in a lot of time and energy and resources without getting incremental benefit. And so one thing we really focused on is allowing people to download an app instantly and instantly start using it without having to consult with a lot of people because it actually is running completely turnkey and locally. And I think that is probably the biggest sort of meta risk that people are going to be running into right now.
Great. So your tagline is instant private automations. What does that really mean? And what are the things that companies are automating with your product?
So what it means specifically is that people can use it instantly when they connect it to their data. It's happening privately. So we have a embedding that happens on the device itself, on the computer. We have a RAG pipeline we've built ourselves that automatically grabs the right data to enable the LLM to process it. And then we have the application running on the device so that you don't necessarily need to worry about us hosting any files. So that's the instant and private component of it. We do have the option to use ephemeral computing where you can have a cloud LLM on Grok providing you advice and answers, but that is not saved. So it flushes out immediately once you actually upload the data. So that's the instant and private. And then the automation piece is really the observation that people are really not using AI as much as they probably could and should. I think there's an inherent friction in the chat box. The chat box is the dominant UI. It's what ChatGPT has been able to produce. And ultimately, other people have copied that. And I think it's a great accessible UI. Everyone understands it intuitively. At the same time, there's high friction. You have to know how to write something. You have to know what to write. In the meantime, this technology is available always. And if you're using your local compute, it's available whenever your computer's running. And so there's no reason why you should be blocked by having to write something in. You should actually have an automation running in the background, doing all the things you might need to do, whether it's monitoring customer service chats for some kind of issue, monitoring your inbox for an email. One great automation idea someone shared with me is monitoring your inbox for an email with emotional content. So you're immediately notified if there's some kind of a landmine in your inbox that you need to get to as soon as possible. We all, just thinking of messaging, we all deal with tons of different inboxes at this point, including Discord and Slack and your email inboxes, sometimes multiple email inboxes. Just having something monitoring that on a regular basis and telling you if there's something you need to deal with is an excellent automation. That's just a starting point. And of course, you need to be comfortable connecting all that data for that to work. And so the idea of automations is that you can have things running regularly that are making you a lot more productive and giving you a lot more impact in your job.
That's a great example. And I imagine you could also do that if it was on a server and you had all your employees connected to the server. You could automate things between your employees too. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Great. So, what resources do you recommend to listeners who want to learn more about your company, but also about the points that you made around open source and small language models and having your model behind the firewall and some of these really important principles that you've covered?
So I think one thing I would recommend is to review our white paper. It'll probably be out by the time this podcast is out. And I think that gives everyone a sense of where we're coming from. So you can go to knapsack.ai and download that. The second thing I would recommend is to actually just start experimenting with using local LLMs and see, how you like it. Ultimately, we are in private beta. And so go to knapsack.ai and sign up for our private beta, and you will be able to see what we can do. But we definitely encourage people to download LM Studio or other local apps to understand how those might work. And those do not generally connect with your data, but it gives you a sense of what's possible. I also really encourage people to start thinking about automation ideas without worrying about where their data might go and thinking about what they might do with that. I think ultimately there's a whole new sphere of innovation that will open up if people start, experimenting a little bit with that. And I would encourage people to do that. And I imagine that, especially if we're talking on device, the fact of the matter is we have a lot of, new functionality that opens up to us. We can actually use all of the capabilities of the device, including screen recording, the microphone, et cetera. Because it's on device, there's no latency. So you can actually have in real time information coming at you. For example, while you're in a meeting, you can have suggestions coming at you on things you should be bringing up because it's all happening locally. You don't have a round trip. You don't have to worry about latency. You have situations where on device, while you're on the go, you can have things happening in the background without having to share your location or other information. So I think thinking through those opportunities is really what the main thing I would recommend people do, because ultimately with our application, you'll be able to build your own automations and then have a pretty dramatic impact on your life.
Great. So as we wrap up, what would you like our listeners to take away from our conversation today?
The first thing to take away is that we're at the very beginning of this AI world and that there is a way to actually use AI at work without violating whatever internal agreements or external agreements you have. And that we should work together to find out how to do that. And so that's the main thing I would take away.
Mark Heynen, Chief Product Officer and co-founder of Knapsack, thank you so much for talking with me today and sharing your really fabulous insights about where we're going and how we can use AI at work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of AI Realized podcast. We hope you enjoyed hearing about what's new now and next for enterprise AI.
And let us know what topics would help you on your journey to use AI to redesign your organization from the inside out. Remember to share this episode with a friend, subscribe and leave a review, and listen to more episodes of the AI Realized podcast.